A young woman had traded her sweat and tears to own her dream home in an upscale, quiet neighborhood. In this place, the gazes of wealthy residents were often cold and filled with prejudice. No one had ever imagined that a black woman like her, with her rich brown skin and natural curls, could become the owner of one of the most expensive properties in the area. But the moment she set foot inside the house, an odd feeling crept over her. Something felt off. It was as if something in this house did not want her there. Before diving into the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The young woman stepped into the luxurious home she had just purchased after years of relentless effort. The house was situated in an affluent neighborhood, a place where no one would have expected a black woman like her to be its rightful owner. Her name was Amara. As she walked into the house, the fresh air of the spacious living room was suddenly disrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps coming from the kitchen. A middle-aged housekeeper, Mrs. Margaret, appeared with a stern face and piercing, suspicious eyes. She stopped, still clutching a cleaning cloth in her hand, and sized Amara up from head to toe, from her worn-out sneakers and simple jeans to her smooth, ebony skin. With a sharp tone, she coldly asked, "What are you doing here? This isn't a place where strangers can just walk in." Amara, unfazed, gave a gentle smile, her eyes gleaming with confidence. "I'm the homeowner," she replied, her voice soft yet firm, like a declaration of truth. Mrs. Margaret let out a dry, mocking laugh that echoed through the quiet space. "The homeowner? Do you think I'm foolish enough to believe that nonsense? I've worked here for over 20 years, taking care of the prestigious family that owned this house. This place belongs to the elite, not to someone like you who clearly doesn't belong here." Amara took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, about to explain. But Mrs. Margaret didn't give her a chance. Filled with growing anger, she stepped forward, grabbing Amara's arm and pulling her forcefully toward the door. Amara was taken aback and struggled to free herself, but the woman's grip was firm. "What are you doing? I'm not an intruder," Amara protested, her voice tinged with frustration. "You don't belong here. Do you think I'll just stand by and let someone like you claim ownership of this house? Get out now," Mrs. Margaret nearly shouted, pushing Amara toward the front door. Amara stumbled back, her eyes flashing with hurt, but she remained composed. "I bought this house. This is the result of years of hard work and sacrifice. You can't just throw me out because I don't fit your expectations." But Mrs. Margaret wasn't listening. She yanked Amara's arm harder, shoved her out the door, and slammed it shut. Standing outside, Amara felt a wave of humiliation rising in her chest. She glanced around and noticed the curious eyes of neighbors peeking from their windows, watching her with suspicion. Taking a deep breath, she reached into her purse and pulled out a key. She slid the key into the lock, turned it gently, and the door swung open right before Mrs. Margaret's stunned eyes. The woman stood frozen, unable to believe what she had just witnessed. Amara stepped inside, her gaze unwavering. "I don't need anyone's validation. The truth is, I worked tirelessly to earn this house, and you can't take that away from me." Mrs. Margaret took a step back, her hands trembling. "No, this can't be." Amara looked straight into her eyes and said, "You're used to serving the wealthy, but you never believed that a black woman like me could also succeed. Your prejudice can't change the fact that I am the new owner of this house." Mrs. Margaret stood there, stunned, as silent tears streamed down her face. I'm sorry. I was wrong to judge you." Amara sighed, her gaze softening. "I don't hold any grudges against you, but I hope that from now on, you'll see people with your heart, not through the color of their skin or where they come from." Mrs. Margaret lifted her head, tears rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. She turned to leave, unable to face the shame consuming her. But before she could take a step, Amara spoke up. "How long have you worked here?" Mrs. Margaret hesitated, her voice trembling. "Over 20 years. I cared for the previous family and watched them build this house brick by brick. When they went bankrupt and left, I was allowed to stay and serve the new owner. But I never imagined the new owner would be you. I thought it would be someone powerful and wealthy, like before." Amara smiled warmly, her eyes filled with compassion. "Then stay. I don't just need a housekeeper. I need someone who understands every corner of this home. You know, I grew up without a real family. If you'd like, you can become a part of this home, not as a servant, but as family." Mrs. Margaret froze, tears flowing uncontrollably. She fell to her knees, grabbing Amara's hands, sobbing, "You don't understand. I once turned a little black girl away from this very door when she begged for a piece of leftover bread. I was cruel. I don't deserve your kindness." Amara slowly knelt down and gently helped Mrs. Margaret to her feet. Her eyes were warm yet firm, as if she could see through all the guilt and regret buried deep inside the older woman. "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is that you're brave enough to face them and want to change. I believe in you." Her voice carried no resentment, only forgiveness and deep understanding. Mrs. Margaret's hands trembled as she clung to Amara's, tears streaming down her weathered face. I don't deserve forgiveness. I treated you so horribly." Amara squeezed her hand gently, cutting off her self-blame. "But when the whole world turned its back on me, you chose to stay and stand by me. To me, that's enough to make you worthy of a new beginning." The news about Amara, a young black girl who rose from nothing to own a luxurious house in an upper-class neighborhood, spread like wildfire in the dark. At first, the whispers behind closed doors were filled with doubt and disdain. How could she afford it? There must be something shady going on. The real drama exploded when Mr. Richard, a wealthy and powerful businessman in the neighborhood, slowly stepped forward from the crowd. His cold eyes and sly smirk hinted that he was holding a secret that could destroy Amara at any moment. He simply couldn't accept the fact that a girl like Amara could stand on equal footing with the elite. At a grand neighborhood gathering, with a glass of red wine swirling in his hand, he declared loudly, "I don't believe she bought that house with clean money. I've hired lawyers and private investigators to dig into her past. Soon, you'll all see that she's nothing but a fraud." His words were like a stone cast into a still pond, stirring waves of doubt and suspicion throughout the neighborhood. The pressure on Amara grew heavier day by day. She received anonymous threats, eerie phone calls in the middle of the night, and judgmental stares from behind every curtain as she walked outside. But she didn't break. On a stormy afternoon, as thunder roared through the sky, Mrs. Margaret, the maid who once tried to kick Amara out of her own house, unexpectedly appeared at the neighborhood council meeting. She stepped onto the platform, facing dozens of eyes eagerly waiting for Amara's downfall. With a trembling but determined voice, she spoke. "I once believed that Amara didn't deserve this house. I pushed her away. I mocked her. But she forgave me and gave me a home when all I had left was shame. If she's a fraud, then I'm the biggest fool for trusting her. But I know the truth. She's the kindest soul I've ever met." Her words sliced through the fog of prejudice, leaving the crowd in stunned silence. But Mr. Richard wasn't ready to lose. He pulled out a stack of documents, claiming they were evidence of Amara's fraudulent business practices. The entire neighborhood held its breath, waiting for Amara's downfall. And then, something no one expected happened. The heavy doors slowly creaked open. A middle-aged man, dressed simply and carrying an old leather briefcase, stepped inside. All eyes turned to him as he walked toward the center of the room. "My name is James," he said with a calm, emotional voice. "I used to be an engineer who worked with Amara when she started her company. You think she bought this house with dirty money? No. Amara sacrificed her sleep, even skipped meals, just to pay her employees when her company was on the verge of collapse. The app she created changed the lives of millions of poor children, including mine. This house wasn't bought with fraud, but with the blood, sweat, and tears she poured into her dream for years. The crowd fell silent. Their doubtful eyes slowly turned to admiration, while Mr. Richard stood frozen in shock. No one had imagined that behind Amara's quiet and humble demeanor was a shocking truth. The app she silently developed not only changed the lives of millions of poor children around the world, but also brought her an immense fortune, one she rightfully earned through hard work and sacrifice. The so-called evidence Mr. Richard presented was exposed as a complete fabrication. With no way out, he was forced to publicly apologize, his face burning with shame under the scornful gazes of those around him. Meanwhile, Amara stood quietly, her eyes calm yet filled with pride, as if she had long been prepared for this moment. The crowd's faith in her only grew stronger when Peter, Amara's closest friend, stepped forward and revealed another shocking truth. Do you know why Amara was able to afford this house? She created an app that provided free education to millions of poor children worldwide. But what's even more admirable is that Amara turned down dozens of offers to sell her app for a fortune that could have allowed her to live in luxury for the rest of her life. She told me, if she sold it, those poor kids would lose their only chance to change their lives. Amara chose to hold on to her dream, even if it meant enduring pressure and being doubted by the world. Peter's words left the entire neighborhood in complete silence. They began to realize that Amara was not just a lucky black girl who happened to own this luxurious house. Behind her was a journey filled with hardship and perseverance. Now that the truth had been revealed, the way people looked at Amara had changed, from doubt to admiration, from rejection to respect. From that day on, Amara's house was no longer just a symbol of resilience. She and Mrs. Margaret turned the basement into a small library, where those who had been cast aside by society, from homeless children to single mothers, could come to learn and find hope. And then, something strange happened in the house that Amara never expected. Late one night, under the pale moonlight streaming through the attic window, Amara decided to search through the old belongings to find something to decorate the study corner she had just set up downstairs. In the dusty darkness, she stumbled upon an old wooden chest, worn and bent by time. The surface was covered in dust and cobwebs, and the rusty lock clung tightly as if refusing to be touched. With curiosity burning inside, Amara used a small iron bar to pry it open. Her heart pounded as the lid creaked, revealing a stack of crumpled, yellowed letters with faded ink and a black and white photograph of a black woman, her face marked with sorrow, but her eyes burning with an unyielding fire. The letters told the story of Abigail, a female musician who had once lived in this house nearly a century ago. She wasn't a glamorous performer on grand stages, but a pianist who played in shabby bars, earning every penny to chase her dream. Through the trembling lines, Amara read about a woman who had been rejected by this very neighborhood. They called her a filthy beggar, refused to let her perform at the local concert hall because of her skin color, and even spread rumors that she stole money from customers. Abigail had fought, composed music, and dreamed of having her own concert. But in the end, she died alone in this very house, with no one to visit her and no one to hear the music she left behind. Amara sank to the floor, clutching the letter as tears streamed down her face. She saw herself in Abigail, the time she was kicked out of stores for looking suspicious, the night she went hungry while pouring her soul into her code. This house was not merely a reward for Amara. It was an invisible thread that connected her to another woman who had once fought, but lost. But why did Abigail leave these letters behind? Were they waiting for someone to find them? Or were they simply the desperate cries of a soul that no one ever heard? Amara brought Abigail's story to Mrs. Margaret. The old maid, who had worked for several families in the neighborhood, suddenly recalled, "I once heard the old gardener say, there was a black woman who lived here long ago. They drove her out, accusing her of stealing a gold bracelet from the former mayor's house. It must have been Abigail." Curious, Amara rummaged through the chest again and found a tiny piece of paper tucked beneath the bottom panel. The faded handwriting read, "The bracelet is not mine. It's under the kitchen floor." Amara rushed to the kitchen, pried open the wooden plank near the fireplace, and there it was, a small, tarnished gold bracelet lying forgotten in the dust. The truth sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The bracelet was a family heirloom of the former mayor, lost nearly a century ago. Abigail had been falsely accused and shunned for something she never did. At the next neighborhood meeting, Amara placed the bracelet on the table in front of everyone. Her voice was cold and steady. "You killed Abigail with your accusations. She was never a thief, she was the victim. Now tell me, what will you do about it?" The crowd fell silent. Some lowered their heads in shame. Meanwhile, the story spread beyond the neighborhood. A local journalist dug deeper and discovered that Abigail had once composed a piece of music that had never been played, a composition titled "Silent Soul," buried in the city's archives along with other forgotten documents. The journalist reached out to Amara and brought her to the archive, where they uncovered the handwritten sheet music, the notes trembling with raw emotion. Amara made a decision. She began hosting small concerts right in her home, inviting young artists from different backgrounds to perform. The melodies that had once been silenced by prejudice and injustice now echoed through the very walls that had witnessed Abigail's suffering. Amara even taught the children from the community to play Abigail's song on an old piano that Mrs. Margaret had restored. That night, under the dim streetlights and the chilling wind, Abigail's music was heard for the first time in a century. The mayor's grandson was present, but this time, he dared not utter a word. Slowly, the neighborhood began to change. Some people came to apologize to Amara, bringing cakes and awkward words of regret. Others quietly left flowers at her doorstep. Some even slipped money into her mailbox as a way of atoning for what their ancestors had done to Abigail. Mrs. Margaret, once the woman who tried to kick Amara out of the house, became her fiercest protector, ready to confront anyone who dared to question her young mistress. And so, Amara's house became more than just a place to live. It became a symbol of hope, of justice, and forgiveness. The once cold-hearted neighborhood learned to open their hearts and embrace the change that Amara had brought. As for Mrs. Margaret, she would often say, "Amara didn't just buy this house with money, she awakened its soul with her heart."